I should have known from the moment I stepped into Ashford Hall that a man who keeps every mirror in his house covered will never allow himself to be seen. But I was young then, 22 years old and desperate for respectability, and I believed that duty and silence could protect me from the cruelty of the world. I arrived on a cold afternoon in late autumn, the kind of day where the sky presses down upon the earth like a hand over a mouth. And the housekeeper told me in a clipped voice that I was to care for the Duke's niece and to stay out of sight as much as possible. The child had lost her mother a year prior, she explained, and His Grace did not tolerate noise, questions, or the presence of women who spoke too freely. I nodded and said nothing, because I had learned long ago that women like me, without family or fortune, survived by becoming invisible. The child's name was Eleanor, and she was 6 years old with pale golden hair and eyes the color of winter fog. She did not cry when I entered her nursery that first day, but she watched me with a stillness that unnerved me, as though she were weighing my soul on some invisible scale. I knelt before her and smiled, and I told her my name was Anne, and that I would take care of her now. She did not answer, but she reached out one small hand and touched the edge of my sleeve, and I understood then that she was testing whether I would stay or disappear like all the others before me. I stayed. I read to her by candlelight and brushed her hair each morning and sang softly when the wind howled through the corridors at night. And slowly, over days and weeks, she began to speak to me in whispers, as though words were fragile things that could shatter if spoken too loudly. The estate itself was a place of shadows and secrets, built of gray stone that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The corridors stretched endlessly in every direction, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me wherever I walked. The servants moved through the halls like ghosts, speaking only when necessary and never meeting my gaze directly. There was a heaviness in the air, a weight of grief and anger that pressed down upon everything, and I felt it most keenly in the West Wing where the Duke kept his private chambers. That part of the house was forbidden to me, forbidden to everyone except his valet and the housekeeper, and I learned quickly not to ask questions about what lay behind those closed doors. I did not meet the Duke for nearly a month. He was a shadow in that house, a presence felt but never seen, and the servants spoke of him only in murmurs and with eyes cast downward. They said he had loved his wife deeply, madly even, and that her betrayal had turned him into something cold and unforgiving. They said she had taken a lover while he was away on business, and that when he returned and discovered the truth, she had thrown herself from the cliffs near the estate rather than face his rage. They said he blamed all women for her sin, and that he would never marry again, never trust again, never allow softness into his heart. I listened to these stories and felt a strange ache in my chest, not pity exactly, but something closer to recognition. I knew what it was to be broken by love, to close oneself off so completely that even kindness felt like a threat. The maids whispered other things too, things they thought I could not hear. They said the Duchess had been beautiful and cruel, that she had married the Duke for his title and his fortune, and had never loved him at all. They said she had flaunted her affairs openly toward the end, laughing at his pain, mocking his devotion. They said he had found her letters, dozens of them, written to her lover in words so intimate and vicious that they had destroyed whatever remained of his heart. And they said that on the night she died, he had confronted her in the portrait gallery, and that her screams had echoed through the entire house before she ran out into the storm and over the cliffs. No one knew what he had said to her. No one dared to ask. But the guilt and the rage had consumed him ever since, turning him into a man who could neither forgive nor forget. When I finally saw him, it was by accident. I had taken Eleanor into the gardens one afternoon to gather late roses, and we were laughing together, her small hands sticky with pollen, when I heard the sharp crack of boots on gravel. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the edge of the stone path, with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression carved from ice. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black, and his face was hard and beautiful in the way that cliffs are beautiful, something you admire from a distance but would never dare to touch. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they fixed on me with such intensity that I felt my breath catch in my throat. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind stirred the hem of my skirt and carried the scent of roses between us, and I saw something flicker across his face, something that might have been surprise or pain or something else entirely. Then Eleanor called out to him, "Uncle, come see the roses," and he turned away without a word and disappeared back into the house. That night, the housekeeper summoned me to the library. I went with my heart hammering in my chest, certain I had done something wrong, certain I was about to be dismissed. The room was vast and lined with books from floor to ceiling, and a fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The Duke stood by the fire with a glass of brandy in his hand, and he did not look at me when I entered. He told me in a voice like granite that I was to keep Eleanor away from the West Wing, away from the portrait gallery, and away from him unless absolutely necessary. He told me that I was paid to educate her and care for her, not to parade her about like some sentimental decoration. He told me that if I had any questions or concerns, I was to address them to the housekeeper, not to him. And then, finally, he turned and looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, something raw and wounded, before it vanished behind that iron mask. I curtsied and said, "Yes, Your Grace," and I left the room with my hands trembling and my cheeks burning with humiliation. The weeks passed, and winter settled over the estate like a shroud. Snow buried the gardens, and frost glittered on the windows, and the house grew colder and quieter until it felt like a tomb. I kept Eleanor close and warm, teaching her letters and numbers and the names of birds, and I tried not to think about the man who haunted the halls like a ghost. But I saw him sometimes, late at night when I could not sleep, standing alone in the portrait gallery, staring up at a painting of a woman with red hair and cruel green eyes. I saw the way his shoulders curved inward, the way his hands clenched into fists, and I understood then that he was not angry at all. He was drowning. He was a man trapped in the wreckage of his own life, unable to move forward and unwilling to let go of the past. And despite everything, despite his coldness and his cruelty, I felt something stir in my chest when I looked at him. Something dangerous and foolish that I tried desperately to ignore. It was in January, on a night when the wind howled like a living thing, that everything changed. Eleanor woke screaming from a nightmare, and I held her close and rocked her until her sobs quieted. But when I carried her back to bed, she clung to me and whispered that she was afraid of dying like her mama, afraid of falling and never being caught. My heart broke for her, and without thinking, I kissed her forehead and promised her that I would never let her fall, that I would always be there to catch her. She believed me. She fell asleep in my arms, and I sat beside her bed and watched the snow fall outside the window, and I made a silent vow that no matter what happened, I would protect this child. She was innocent and good, and she deserved better than to grow up in a house filled with ghosts and grief. The next morning, a letter arrived from London. The housekeeper brought it to the Duke, and within the hour, the entire household was in an uproar. I did not understand what had happened until one of the maids whispered to me in the hallway that a scandal had erupted in society. Someone had spread a rumor that Eleanor was not the Duke's niece at all, but his illegitimate daughter, born of an affair with a servant. It was a vicious lie, of course. Eleanor was his late brother's child, orphaned when both her parents died in a carriage accident, but the damage was done. The whispers had reached the drawing rooms and ballrooms of London, and the Duke's name, already tarnished by his wife's betrayal and suicide, was now dragged through the mud once more. The gossip columns were printing speculation. The matrons of society were whispering behind their fans, and the Duke's standing. His honor, everything he had left, was crumbling beneath the weight of this new scandal. I watched him that day from the shadows of the staircase, watched him pace the length of the great hall like a caged animal, and I saw the rage and helplessness warring in his eyes. He was a man who controlled everything, who demanded order and obedience and silence, and now he was being destroyed by something he could not fight. Whispers and rumors could not be challenged with fists or fury. They spread like poison, unseen and unstoppable, and I saw in his face that he knew it. I saw the desperation, the fear, and beneath it all, the terrible loneliness of a man who had no one left to trust. That evening, he summoned me again. This time, when I entered the library, he was sitting in a chair by the fire with his head in his hands, and he looked more human than I had ever seen him. He looked broken. He did not speak for a long time, and I stood there in silence, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, he raised his head and looked at me, and his eyes were hollow. He told me that the scandal would ruin Eleanor. He told me that no respectable family would associate with her, that she would be ostracized and shamed for something that was not her fault. He told me that the only way to silence the rumors was to prove them false beyond all doubt. And then he said the words that would change my life forever. He said that he needed to marry, and quickly, to show society that Eleanor was indeed his niece and that his household was respectable and proper. He said that he had no time to find a suitable bride from among the nobility, and that he needed someone who would accept the arrangement without question or sentiment. And then he looked at me, and I understood. He was asking me to marry him, not out of love or affection, but out of necessity, a marriage of convenience to save a child's reputation and restore his own. I stood there frozen, unable to speak, unable to breathe. He told me that I would want for nothing, that I would have a generous allowance and a position of respect, and that the only thing required of me was silence and obedience. He told me that it would be a marriage in name only, that he would never touch me, never expect anything from me beyond the appearance of propriety. And he told me that if I refused, I would be dismissed immediately, and Eleanor would suffer the consequences of my selfishness. I should have said no. I should have walked away and found another position, another life, far from that cursed house and that broken man. But I thought of Eleanor, of her small hand in mine, and her whispered fears, and I knew that I could not abandon her. I knew that without this marriage, she would be destroyed by the cruelty of society, and I could not bear to let that happen. So I looked into the Duke's cold, dead eyes, and I said yes. I agreed to marry a man who did not want me, who would never love me, who saw me as nothing more than a tool to protect his family name. And as I stood there in that firelit library, I felt the last piece of my heart turn to stone. The wedding was arranged for the following week. The wedding took place on a gray morning in late January, in the private chapel on the estate grounds, with only the housekeeper and the vicar as witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration of any kind. I wore a simple dress of pale blue silk that the housekeeper had pulled from storage, a gown that had once belonged to someone else, and I stood before the altar with my hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The Duke arrived late, dressed in black as always, and he did not look at me once during the entire ceremony. His voice was flat and emotionless as he spoke his vows. And when the vicar pronounced us man and wife, he did not kiss me. He simply turned and walked out of the chapel, leaving me standing there alone with the echo of his footsteps fading into silence. I told myself that it did not matter. I told myself that I had not expected kindness or affection, that this was a business arrangement and nothing more. But as I walked back to the main house through the cold morning air, I felt a heaviness settle over me that had nothing to do with the weather. I had traded my freedom for a title I did not want, and I had bound myself to a man who despised me without even knowing my name. I was the Duchess of Ashford now, but I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The household staff treated me with a strange mixture of deference and suspicion. They curtsied when I passed and called me Your Grace, but I saw the questions in their eyes, the whispers that followed me down the corridors. They knew this marriage was a sham, a desperate attempt to salvage reputations. and they wondered how long it would last before the truth came out. I tried to ignore them and focus on Eleanor, who was the only bright spot in that dark house. She was delighted that I would not be leaving, and she clung to me even more tightly than before, as though she feared that even marriage could not keep me by her side. I read to her every evening and tucked her into bed with stories of faraway places where people were kind and the sun always shone, and I let her innocence soothe the raw edges of my wounded heart. The Duke and I lived like strangers under the same roof. He kept to his chambers in the West Wing, and I was given a suite of rooms in the East Wing that overlooked the gardens. We took our meals separately, and days would pass without me seeing him at all. When we did cross paths, he acknowledged me with a curt nod and nothing more. He never asked how I was, never inquired about Eleanor's progress, never showed the slightest interest in my existence. It was as though I were a piece of furniture he had purchased out of necessity, something to be used when needed and ignored the rest of the time. And I accepted it because I had known from the beginning what this marriage would be. But London society did not accept it quite so easily. Word of our sudden marriage spread quickly, and within days, letters began arriving from every corner of the aristocracy. Some were congratulatory, dripping with false sweetness and thinly veiled curiosity. Others were openly hostile, questioning my background and my motives and my right to bear the title of Duchess. The gossip columns speculated endlessly about who I was and where I had come from, inventing elaborate stories about secret love affairs and hidden scandals. The truth that I was a nobody who had been a companion and governess was far too mundane for their tastes. They wanted drama and intrigue, and when they could not find it, they created it. The Duke ignored it all. He locked himself away in his study and refused to see anyone, refused to respond to the letters or acknowledge the gossip. But I could not ignore it, because I saw what it was doing to Eleanor. The child was old enough to sense the tension in the house, and she began having nightmares again, waking in the dark hours before dawn, calling for her mother. I held her and soothed her and tried to shield her from the ugliness of the adult world, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers reached her ears. And I knew that when that happened, all of this, the marriage, the sacrifice, the humiliation, would have been for nothing. It was in early February, barely 2 weeks after the wedding, that the Duke summoned me to his study. I had not been in that room before, and when I entered, I was struck by how cold and sparse it was. There were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos, just shelves of books and a massive desk piled high with correspondence. He stood by the window with his back to me, looking out at the frozen landscape, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, and his voice was tight, with barely controlled rage. He told me that the rumors had not stopped. He told me that despite our marriage, society still believed Eleanor was his illegitimate child, and that some were now speculating that I was the mother, that we had married to cover up a shameful affair. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it were not so devastating. He turned to face me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen before. It was not anger exactly, but something darker and more dangerous. He told me that we would have to make a public appearance together, that we would have to attend a ball in London and present ourselves as a respectable married couple. He told me that I would need proper gowns and jewels, and that I would be expected to play the role of Duchess convincingly. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if I embarrassed him in any way, if I failed to meet society's expectations, he would annul the marriage and send me away without a reference, ensuring that I would never find work again. It was a threat, plain and simple, and I understood that despite the wedding vows and the title, I was still nothing more than a servant in his eyes. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him that I had given up everything for his sake and for Eleanor's sake, and that he had no right to threaten me. But I did not. I simply nodded and said, "Yes, Your Grace," and I left the room with my heart pounding and my eyes burning with unshed tears. I went to my chambers and locked the door and allowed myself to cry for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hall. I cried for the girl I had been, the one who had believed that kindness mattered and that duty would be rewarded. I cried for the woman I had become, trapped in a gilded cage with a man who saw me as nothing more than a pawn in his endless game of pride and reputation. And I cried for Eleanor, who deserved so much better than the broken, bitter people who claimed to care for her. The preparations for the London ball consumed the next 2 weeks. A seamstress was brought to the estate to fit me for gowns, and the housekeeper instructed me on the etiquette and protocols expected of a duchess. I learned which fork to use, and how to curtsy to royalty, and how to smile politely while enduring insults. I learned that my worth would be measured not by my character or my intelligence, but by my appearance and my ability to perform the role society demanded. It was exhausting and humiliating, but I endured it because I had no other choice. The Duke watched my transformation with cold detachment, offering neither encouragement nor criticism, and I wondered if he even saw me as a person anymore, or if I had become just another problem to be managed. The night before we were to leave for London, Eleanor came to my room in tears. She had overheard 2 of the maids talking, saying that the marriage was fake and that I would leave soon, just like everyone else. I held her close and stroked her hair and told her that I would never leave her, that I had promised to protect her, and I meant it. She looked up at me with those wide, solemn eyes and asked me if I loved her uncle. The question took me by surprise, and I did not know how to answer. How could I explain to a 6-year-old child that love had nothing to do with this marriage, that her uncle and I were bound together by duty and desperation and nothing more? So I told her a version of the truth. I told her that her uncle was a complicated man who had been hurt very badly and that he had forgotten how to let people care for him. I told her that sometimes people need time to heal and that we had to be patient with him. She seemed satisfied with that answer, and she fell asleep in my arms, trusting and innocent and believing that everything would be all right. But I was not so sure. As I lay awake that night, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, I could not shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. The Duke's anger had been building for weeks, simmering beneath that cold facade, and I knew that it would not take much to make it explode. I had seen the way he looked at me sometimes, when he thought I was not watching, and there was something in his eyes that frightened me. It was not hatred exactly, but something more complicated. It was as though he resented me for existing, for being in his house, for reminding him of all the things he had lost. And I knew that when we arrived in London, when we were forced to stand side by side and pretend to be something we were not, that resentment would find a way to break free. We traveled to London in his carriage, a journey that took the better part of a day. The Duke sat across from me in stony silence, reading correspondence and ignoring my presence entirely. I looked out the window at the passing countryside and tried not to think about what awaited us. The city loomed on the horizon as the sun began to set, a sprawling mass of buildings and smoke and noise, and I felt my stomach tighten with dread. I had been to London only once before, years ago, and I had been overwhelmed by the crowds and the chaos. Now I was returning as a duchess, expected to navigate the treacherous waters of high society without making a single misstep. It seemed an impossible task. We arrived at the Duke's London townhouse just as darkness fell. It was a grand building on a fashionable street, all white stone and gleaming windows, and the staff lined up to greet us with perfect precision. I was shown to a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor, and I changed into one of the new gowns that had been prepared for me, a creation of emerald silk with delicate embroidery and a neckline that felt far too low. A maid dressed my hair and fastened a necklace of diamonds around my throat, jewels that had belonged to the Duke's mother. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked like a duchess, cold and elegant and untouchable, but inside I was still just Anne, terrified and alone. The ball was held at the home of Lady Harrington, a formidable woman who was known for hosting the most exclusive events of the season. The Duke and I arrived fashionably late, and as we stepped out of the carriage, I felt the weight of 100 eyes upon us. The crowd parted as we walked through the entrance hall, whispers following in our wake, and I kept my head high and my expression serene even though my heart was racing. The Duke offered me his arm, the first time he had touched me since the wedding, and I took it, feeling the rigid tension in his body. We were two people playing roles, pretending to be something we were not, and I wondered how long we could keep up the charade. The ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of candlelight and music, filled with the cream of London society dressed in their finest silks and jewels. We were announced, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, and a ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. People turned to stare, some with curiosity, some with hostility, and I felt like a specimen under glass. The Duke led me onto the dance floor for the opening waltz, and as we moved together to the music, he finally spoke. He told me in a low voice that I was to smile and appear happy, that I was to respond graciously to anyone who spoke to me, and that I was to give them no reason to doubt the legitimacy of our marriage. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and we continued to dance in silence, two strangers performing an elaborate lie. As the evening wore on, I was introduced to countless people whose names and faces blurred together. They smiled and congratulated us and asked probing questions disguised as polite conversation. I answered carefully, offering just enough information to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything substantial. But I could see the doubt in their eyes, the suspicion that something was not quite right. And I knew that no matter how well I played this role, there would always be those who questioned my place here, who saw me as an interloper who did not belong. It was near midnight when disaster struck. A woman approached us, tall and beautiful with red hair and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Lady Pemberton, and she said she had been a dear friend of the late Duchess. The Duke's entire body went rigid beside me, and I felt the air between us turn to ice. Lady Pemberton looked at me with undisguised contempt and said in a voice loud enough for those nearby to hear that it was remarkable how quickly some men recovered from grief, and how convenient it was that he had found a replacement so soon after his wife's tragic death. The words were like a slap, and I saw the Duke's jaw clench, saw his hands curl into fists. But before he could respond, Lady Pemberton turned her venom on me, asking sweetly where I had come from and what my family name was, knowing full well that I had no family of any consequence. I opened my mouth to respond, but the Duke cut me off. He said in a voice like thunder that my background was none of her concern, and that she would do well to remember her place. But Lady Pemberton was not finished. She laughed, a cold, cruel sound, and said that everyone knew this marriage was a farce, that I was nothing more than a governess he had married to silence the scandal, and that no amount of silk and diamonds could change the fact that I was beneath him. The room had gone silent now, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen. And in that moment, I saw something snap inside the Duke. He released my arm and stepped away from me, and when he looked at me, his eyes were filled with such rage and humiliation that I felt my knees go weak. He said my name, just once, and it sounded like an accusation. And then he turned to the crowd and said in a voice that carried across the entire ballroom that Lady Pemberton was correct, that our marriage had been a mistake, a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation that had only made things worse. He said that he had been a fool to think that marrying someone like me could restore his family's honor, and that he would be seeking an annulment immediately. The words hit me like physical blows, and I stood there frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps, and I saw the triumph in Lady Pemberton's eyes, the satisfaction of having destroyed me in front of everyone. The Duke walked away without another word, leaving me standing alone in the center of that glittering ballroom, exposed and humiliated beyond all measure. I do not remember how I got out of that house or how I made it back to the townhouse. I only remember the faces staring at me, the laughter and the whispers, and the terrible, crushing weight of shame. When I reached my rooms, I tore off the diamonds and the silk gown, and I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing until there were no tears left. The Duke had destroyed me with a few careless words, and I knew that my life as I had known it was over. By morning, I was gone. I packed my single bag and left the townhouse before anyone else was awake, and I disappeared into the crowded streets of London without looking back. I had no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. But I knew that I could not stay, could not endure another moment in that man's presence. He had broken me completely, and I hated him for it. I hated him with a fierce, burning intensity that gave me the strength to keep walking, to keep moving forward, even when I wanted to lie down and die. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that I was already carrying his child. I spent the first weeks after leaving London in a fog of despair and exhaustion, moving from one cheap boarding house to another, stretching the few coins I had managed to save during my time at Ashford Hall. The city was vast and indifferent, swallowing me whole, and I was grateful for the anonymity it provided. No one knew who I was or where I had come from, and I intended to keep it that way. I found work where I could, mending clothes for a seamstress in Whitechapel, scrubbing floors in a tavern near the docks, anything that would keep me fed and sheltered. The work was hard and the pay was meager, but it was mine, earned through my own labor and not given to me as charity or obligation. For the first time in months, I felt like a person again, not a pawn in someone else's game. But my body began to betray me in ways I did not understand. I woke each morning with waves of nausea that left me weak and trembling, and I found myself exhausted by tasks that should have been simple. At first, I thought it was merely the toll of grief and overwork, the natural consequence of everything I had endured. But as the weeks turned into a month and then two, and my monthly courses did not come, a terrible suspicion began to take root in my mind. I tried to deny it, tried to convince myself that it was impossible, but deep down, I knew the truth. The Duke had lied when he said our marriage would never be consummated. There had been one night, just one, in the days before we left for London. It had been late, and I had been walking through the darkened corridors of Ashford Hall, unable to sleep, when I encountered him in the portrait gallery. He had been drinking, something I had never seen him do before, and there was a wildness in his eyes that frightened me. He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, and he said my name in a voice rough with something that might have been anguish or desire or both. Before I could respond, he had crossed the distance between us and pulled me into his arms, kissing me with a desperate intensity that stole my breath. I should have pushed him away, should have fled back to my rooms, but I did not. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, I allowed him to lead me to his chambers, and I gave myself to him in the darkness, believing in that moment that perhaps something real existed beneath the cold facade he showed the world. But in the morning, he was gone, and when I saw him again, he treated me with the same icy indifference as before, as though that night had never happened. I told myself it had meant nothing to him, that it had been a moment of weakness brought on by drink and loneliness, and I tried to forget it. Now, alone in a cramped room in one of London's poorest neighborhoods, I understood that that single night had changed everything. I was carrying his child, the child of a man who had publicly humiliated me and cast me aside like rubbish. The irony was not lost on me. Society had accused him of fathering a bastard, and now, through his own actions, he had created exactly what they had suspected. I did not know what to do. I had no family to turn to, no friends who could help me, and I knew that once my condition became obvious, I would lose whatever work I had managed to find. Women in my situation had few options, and most of them led to tragedy. I could seek out one of the back-alley practitioners who dealt with such matters, but the thought filled me with horror. This child was innocent, and despite everything, despite my anger and my pain, I could not bring myself to harm it. So I made the only decision I could. I would have this baby, and I would raise it alone, and I would never tell anyone who the father was. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. As my body changed and my condition became impossible to hide, I lost my work and was forced to move to even cheaper lodgings on the outskirts of the city. I sold everything I owned except the clothes on my back and a single item I had taken from Ashford Hall, a small gold locket that had belonged to the Duke's mother. I had found it in the drawer of my dressing table shortly before we left for London, and I had kept it, thinking perhaps it had been left there by mistake. Now I understood that it might have been placed there deliberately, perhaps by the Duke himself in some momentary gesture of acknowledgement, though he would never have admitted it. The locket was beautiful, engraved with delicate flowers, and it was the only thing of value I had left. But I could not bring myself to sell it, because it was the only tangible proof that I had ever been connected to that world, to that man, to that life. I gave birth in a charity hospital on a cold night in November, surrounded by strangers who offered me neither comfort nor kindness. The pain was beyond anything I could have imagined, a tearing agony that seemed to go on forever, and I thought I would die there in that stark white room with its smell of carbolic and suffering. But I did not die. I lived, and when they placed my daughter in my arms, all the pain and fear and anger fell away, replaced by a love so fierce and overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. She was tiny and perfect, with dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same deep brown as her father's, and I knew in that moment that I would do anything, endure anything, to protect her. I named her Charlotte, after my own mother who had died when I was young, and I made a vow that she would never know the shame and hardship that circumstances had forced upon us. I would tell her nothing of her father, nothing of the Duke or Ashford Hall or the brief, terrible marriage that had brought her into being. She would grow up believing she was loved and wanted, and she would never have to carry the burden of her parents' mistakes. But survival with an infant was even harder than I had anticipated. I could not work, could not leave her alone, and the few coins I had saved were gone within weeks. I applied to the parish for assistance, swallowing my pride and accepting the meager help they offered, but it was not enough. We lived in a single room with a broken window and rats in the walls, and there were nights when I went to bed hungry so that I could use my rations to keep my milk flowing for Charlotte. I watched other women in similar circumstances give up their children to foundling hospitals or worse, and I understood why they made those choices, but I could not. Charlotte was mine, the only good thing that had come from all the pain, and I would not let her go. It was during those dark months that I thought often of Eleanor. I wondered how she was faring, whether the scandal had died down, whether she still remembered me and the promises I had made. I had failed her by leaving, I knew that, but I had no choice. The Duke had made it clear that I was not welcome, and I could not stay where I was despised. Still, the guilt gnawed at me, and I found myself lying awake at night wondering if she was safe and happy, or if she too had been damaged by the cruelty of the adult world. When Charlotte was 3 months old, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my room, trying to soothe the baby who had been crying for hours, when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a young woman standing in the hallway, well-dressed and clearly out of place in this neighborhood. She introduced herself as Mary, and she said she had been a housemaid at Ashford Hall. My heart stopped. She told me that she had left the Duke's service shortly after I disappeared, unable to bear the atmosphere in that house any longer, and that she had been searching for me ever since. She had heard rumors of a governess who had vanished after a scandal, and through careful inquiry and a bit of luck, she had tracked me down. I let her in, too shocked to do anything else, and she sat on the edge of my narrow bed and looked at Charlotte with wide eyes. She did not ask questions, did not judge, but simply said that she had come because she thought I should know what had happened at Ashford Hall after I left. I told her I did not want to hear it, that my life was here now and the past was dead, but she insisted. She said that the Duke had fallen into a dark despair after the annulment, that he had locked himself away and refused to see anyone, not even Eleanor. She said that the child had been inconsolable, crying for me day and night, and that eventually they had sent her away to live with a distant aunt in the north. The scandal had destroyed what remained of the Duke's reputation, and he had become a recluse, haunted by his own actions and unable to escape the consequences. Mary looked at me with pity in her eyes and said that everyone in the household had known the marriage was real, that they had seen the way the Duke looked at me when he thought no one was watching, and that they believed he had feelings for me that he could not or would not acknowledge. She said that Lady Pemberton's attack at the ball had shattered something inside him, not because it humiliated him, but because it humiliated me, and he had lashed out in a moment of panic and rage, destroying the one thing that might have saved him. I listened to all of this with a growing numbness, unable to reconcile the man she described with the cold, cruel figure I remembered. Before Mary left, she pressed a small purse of coins into my hand, money she had saved from her own wages, and she made me promise that if I ever needed help, I would send word to her. I thanked her, my voice breaking, and after she was gone, I held Charlotte close and wept. I wept for the Duke, trapped in his own private hell, and for Eleanor, exiled from the only home she had known, and for myself, struggling to survive in a world that showed no mercy to women like me. But most of all, I wept because despite everything, despite the pain and the betrayal and the humiliation, a part of me still cared what happened to him, and I hated myself for it. The money Mary gave me bought us a few more weeks of survival, but I knew it would not last. I needed to find a way to support Charlotte and myself, and I needed to do it quickly. I began taking in piecework again, sewing late into the night by candlelight while Charlotte slept, and I sold the few possessions I had left. But it was not enough. Winter was coming, and I knew that without proper food and warmth, we might not survive it. I was desperate, exhausted, and utterly alone, and I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake by keeping Charlotte, if perhaps she would have been better off in a foundling home, where at least she would have been fed and sheltered. It was in this state of despair that I made a decision that would change everything. I took the gold locket, the one tangible connection to Charlotte's father, and I brought it to a pawnbroker. The man examined it carefully and offered me a sum that was far more than I had expected, enough to rent a better room and buy food and coal for several months. But as I stood there, holding the locket in my hand, feeling its weight and remembering the night I had found it, I could not bring myself to sell it. This was Charlotte's inheritance, the only thing she would ever have from her father, and I had no right to take it from her. So I thanked the pawnbroker and left, clutching the locket tightly. That night, I fastened the locket around Charlotte's tiny neck, and I whispered to her that no matter what happened, she would always have this one piece of proof that she came from somewhere, that she was connected to something greater than this shabby room and this desperate existence. She looked up at me with those dark, solemn eyes, so like her father's, and I felt my heart break and mend all at once. I would find a way to survive, I told myself. I would find a way to give her the life she deserved. And I would never, ever let the Duke know that he had a daughter, because he had forfeited that right when he cast me aside. The winter was brutal, but we survived it. I found work as a laundress, hard physical labor that left my hands raw and my back aching, but it paid enough to keep us fed. Charlotte grew stronger and healthier, and she began to smile and laugh, filling our small room with a joy that had been absent from my life for so long. I sang to her and told her stories and loved her with every fiber of my being, and slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild myself. I was not the naive girl who had arrived at Ashford Hall 3 years ago, nor was I the broken woman who had fled London in shame. I was something new, something harder and more resilient, forged in the fires of suffering and loss. But the past, I would learn, is not so easily escaped. On a gray afternoon in early spring, when Charlotte was nearly 3 years old, Mary appeared at my door again. This time, her face was pale, and her hands were shaking, and I knew before she spoke that something terrible had happened. She told me that the Duke was dying. He had fallen ill with a fever that the doctors could not cure, and he was asking for me. He wanted to see me one last time, wanted to beg my forgiveness for what he had done. Mary said that he had been searching for me for months, that he had hired investigators and offered rewards, but I had vanished too completely. Now time was running out, and she had come to ask if I would go to him. I looked at Charlotte, playing with a rag doll on the floor, innocent and happy and unaware of the man whose blood ran in her veins. And I thought about the Duke, the man who had given me a title and then stripped it away, who had shown me one night of passion and then a lifetime of cruelty, who had destroyed me, and yet somehow created the greatest gift I had ever received. I thought about Eleanor, wherever she was, and about all the pain and waste and regret that had defined our brief, terrible connection. And I realized that I had a choice. I could go to him, could tell him about Charlotte, could give him the chance to know his daughter before he died. Or I could walk away, could let him die believing that our story had ended in that London ballroom, could protect Charlotte from ever knowing the man who had rejected us both. I looked at Mary, and I told her no. I would not go to him. Whatever debt I owed had been paid in full by the suffering I had endured, and I would not risk Charlotte's peace and happiness to ease his guilty conscience. Mary nodded slowly, as though she had expected this answer, and she turned to leave. But then Charlotte looked up, and the locket around her neck caught the light, and Mary's eyes went wide. She stared at it, then at Charlotte, then at me, and understanding dawned in her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but I shook my head, and she closed it again. She left without another word, and I locked the door behind her and held Charlotte close, wondering if I had just made the right decision or the worst mistake of my life. 3 days later, I read in the newspaper that the Duke of Ashford had died in his sleep, alone in his chambers at Ashford Hall. The article was brief and cold, noting only that he left no heir and that the title and estate would pass to a distant cousin. There was no mention of a wife, no mention of scandal or shame, just a simple statement that a man had lived and died and left nothing of consequence behind. I folded the newspaper carefully and put it away, and I told myself that this was truly the end, that the past was finally, irrevocably finished. But I was wrong. The past was not finished with me yet. It would return 3 years later in a form I never could have anticipated, and it would force me to confront everything I had tried so hard to forget. 3 years after the Duke's death, I had managed to build something resembling a life. Charlotte was 6 years old now, bright and curious and full of laughter, and I had found steady work as a seamstress in a respectable shop in a better part of London. We had moved to a small but clean apartment with 2 rooms and windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street, and for the first time since leaving Ashford Hall, I felt something close to peace. I had made a few friends among the other women who worked at the shop, and Charlotte attended a small school run by a kind widow who charged very little and asked no questions about absent fathers. We were not wealthy, not by any measure, but we were safe and together, and that was enough. I had learned to live with the secrets I carried. Charlotte knew nothing of her father or her aristocratic blood, and I intended to keep it that way. She believed her father had been a clerk who died before she was born, a simple story that explained everything and revealed nothing. She wore the gold locket always, and when she asked about it, I told her it had belonged to my mother, which was not entirely a lie. The locket had belonged to the Duke's mother after all, and in a strange way, that made it part of Charlotte's heritage, even if she would never know the full truth. I had made peace with my decision to keep her away from that world, to protect her from the pain and complication that came with knowing who her father had been. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April when everything changed. I was working in the back room of the shop, finishing the hem on a gown for one of our wealthier clients, when the bell above the front door chimed. I heard voices, a woman's cultured tones, and the shop owner's deferential responses, but I paid no attention until the shop owner called my name. When I emerged into the front room, I found myself face to face with a woman I had never seen before, elegant, and poised in a traveling dress of deep burgundy, with silver hair swept up beneath a fashionable hat. She looked at me with piercing gray eyes, and I felt an immediate sense of unease, as though she could see straight through me to all the secrets I kept hidden. She introduced herself as Lady Catherine Ashford, the Duke's aunt and the matriarch of the family. My blood turned to ice. She said that she had been searching for me for nearly a year, ever since learning of my existence from Mary, the former housemaid who had visited me those years ago. Mary had kept my secret as long as she could, but when Lady Catherine began making inquiries about her nephew's lost wife, Mary had felt compelled to reveal what she knew. Lady Catherine explained all of this in a calm, measured voice, and then she said the words that made my knees go weak. She said that she knew about Charlotte and that she had come to see the child for herself. I wanted to deny it, to send her away, to protect my daughter from this intrusion, but I knew it was useless. Lady Catherine was not a woman who could be easily dismissed, and she had resources and power that I could never hope to match. So I invited her to my apartment, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door, and I asked the neighbor who sometimes watched Charlotte to bring her home from school. While we waited, Lady Catherine sat in my small parlor and looked around with an expression that was difficult to read. She did not seem disgusted by the modest surroundings, nor did she seem particularly moved. She simply observed, taking in every detail with those sharp gray eyes. When Charlotte arrived, bursting through the door with her usual energy and chattering about something that had happened at school, she stopped short at the sight of the elegant stranger sitting in our parlor. Lady Catherine rose slowly, and I watched as she studied my daughter with an intensity that made me want to snatch Charlotte away and run. But Charlotte, who had inherited none of my wariness, simply smiled and curtsied politely as I had taught her. Lady Catherine's expression softened, and she extended her hand. Charlotte took it, and for a long moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then Lady Catherine's gaze fell to the locket around Charlotte's neck, and her breath caught. She asked Charlotte if she might see the locket more closely, and Charlotte obligingly lifted it for inspection. Lady Catherine touched it with trembling fingers, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. She said in a voice thick with emotion that this locket had belonged to her sister, the Duke's mother, and that it had been missing from the family collection for years. She had assumed it lost or stolen, but here it was, around the neck of a child who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Ashford line. She looked at me then, and I saw both accusation and understanding in her gaze. She knew. She knew everything without me having to say a word. I sent Charlotte to her room with instructions to play quietly, and then I turned to face Lady Catherine. I expected anger or recrimination, but instead, she simply asked me to tell her the truth. So I did. I told her everything, from my arrival at Ashford Hall as a companion to Eleanor, to the forced marriage, to the humiliation at the ball and the night that had resulted in Charlotte's conception. I told her about the 3 years of poverty and struggle, about my decision to keep Charlotte away from the Ashford family, about my conviction that the Duke had forfeited any right to know his daughter when he cast me aside so cruelly. Lady Catherine listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke, and her words shocked me. She said that her nephew had been a fool and a coward, that he had allowed his pain and pride to destroy the one chance at happiness he might have had. She said that she had tried to reason with him after I left, had begged him to search for me and make amends, but he had refused, insisting that the marriage was a mistake and that I was better off without him. It was only in the final months of his life, when the fever took hold and he knew he was dying, that he had confessed to her about that night in the portrait gallery, about the feelings he had refused to acknowledge, about the terrible guilt that had consumed him after I disappeared. He had asked her to find me, to beg my forgiveness, but he had died before she could begin the search. Lady Catherine reached across the small table between us and took my hand. She said that she was not here to take Charlotte away or to disrupt our lives. She said that she understood why I had kept my daughter hidden, and that she respected the sacrifices I had made to protect her. But she also said that Charlotte was the last living descendant of the Duke of Ashford, and that she had a right to know her heritage. She said that the estate and title had passed to a distant cousin, but that there were family properties and funds that rightfully belonged to Charlotte, a trust that had been established for any children the Duke might have had. She said that Charlotte could have a future beyond this modest apartment, that she could be educated and provided for, that she could take her place in the world with dignity and security. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to send Lady Catherine away and keep Charlotte safe in the small, simple world we had built together. But as I looked around our apartment, at the worn furniture and the mended curtains and the school books we could barely afford, I knew that I was being selfish. I had given Charlotte love, but I could not give her opportunity. I could not give her the education and the prospects that her father's name and fortune could provide. And denying her that future simply because I was afraid of losing her to a world I no longer belonged to was not protection, it was cruelty. So I made a bargain with Lady Catherine. I would allow Charlotte to know her heritage and to benefit from the Ashford family resources, but I would not allow her to be taken from me. Lady Catherine agreed immediately. She said that she had no desire to separate mother and child, that she had seen too much damage done by the Ashford family's coldness and pride, and that she wanted to help us, not hurt us. She proposed that Charlotte be enrolled in a good school, one that Lady Catherine would pay for, and that we be provided with a more comfortable home and a modest allowance. In return, Charlotte would spend some holidays and summers at the family estate in the country, where Lady Catherine would teach her about her father's family and ensure that she was properly prepared for whatever future she chose. It was more than I could have hoped for, and yet it felt like a betrayal of everything I had fought to build. But when I looked at Charlotte's room, at the few toys and books that represented all I could give her, I knew that my pride was worth less than her future. So I agreed, and Lady Catherine embraced me with a warmth that took me by surprise. She said that I was a remarkable woman, that I had done what her nephew should have done and protected the innocent at all costs, and that she would make sure Charlotte knew how much her mother had sacrificed for her. The changes came quickly after that. Within a month, we had moved to a charming house in a respectable neighborhood, with a garden and enough rooms for Charlotte to have her own proper bedroom, and for me to have a space to continue my sewing work. Charlotte was enrolled in a school for young ladies where she thrived, making friends and excelling in her studies. Lady Catherine visited often, bringing gifts and stories about the Ashford family, carefully omitting the darker chapters but painting a picture of heritage and belonging that Charlotte embraced with innocent enthusiasm. I watched my daughter transform, watched her grow more confident and poised, and I was grateful and terrified in equal measure. It was during one of Lady Catherine's visits that she told me something that changed everything I thought I knew about the Duke. She said that after I left, he had searched for me desperately, spending a fortune on investigators and offering rewards for any information. She said that he had been devastated by what he had done at the ball, that he had realized too late that Lady Pemberton had manipulated him, playing on his insecurities and his fear of being vulnerable. She said that he had wanted to find me not to absolve himself, but to tell me the truth, that the marriage had never been just a convenience to him, that somewhere in the midst of all the pain and anger, he had fallen in love with me. I listened to this revelation with a numbness that slowly gave way to a grief so profound it took my breath away. All those years of believing I had meant nothing to him, that I had been merely a tool to be used and discarded, and now I learned that he had cared, that he had suffered, that he had died with my name on his lips. It was too late for forgiveness, too late for reconciliation, too late for anything except this terrible, aching knowledge that we had both been victims of pride and fear and the cruelty of circumstances. I wept that night after Lady Catherine left, wept for the man I had hated and pitied, and perhaps, in some small broken way, loved despite everything. As Charlotte grew older, she began asking more questions about her father. Lady Catherine had told her that he had been a great man who had died too young, and Charlotte had accepted this with the unquestioning faith of childhood. But now, at 9 years old, she wanted to know why he had never married her mother properly, why there were no portraits of him in our house, why I grew quiet and sad whenever his name was mentioned. I struggled to answer her questions without lying, trying to find a balance between truth and protection. I told her that her father and I had loved each other, but that circumstances had kept us apart, which was true in a way, even if it left out the worst of the pain. I told her that he had been a complicated man who had suffered greatly, and that he had made mistakes but had also been deeply honorable in many ways. I told her that she should be proud of her heritage, but that she should also remember that who we are is defined not by our bloodlines, but by our choices. Charlotte seemed satisfied with these answers, at least for a time, and life settled into a new rhythm. I continued my work as a seamstress, not because we needed the money, but because it gave me purpose and independence. Charlotte excelled at her studies and began showing a talent for music and languages that delighted Lady Catherine. And I, slowly and painfully, learned to let go of the past and embrace the future we were building together. I would never forget the Duke, would never stop carrying the weight of what had happened between us, but I could choose not to let it define the rest of my life. It was on Charlotte's 10th birthday that Lady Catherine arrived with a letter. She said it had been found among the Duke's papers, sealed and addressed to me, with instructions that it be delivered only if I were ever found. She said she had debated whether to give it to me, whether opening old wounds served any purpose, but she had ultimately decided that I had a right to know what he had wanted to say. I took the letter with trembling hands and waited until I was alone to break the seal. His handwriting was strong and elegant. The letters formed with the precision of a man who controlled everything except his own heart. He began by acknowledging that I had every right to hate him, that he had treated me with inexcusable cruelty, and that he deserved whatever contempt I felt. But he wanted me to understand why, wanted me to explain the fear and the pain that had driven him to destroy the one thing that might have saved him. He wrote about his first wife, about the years of betrayal and lies, about the way she had mocked his love and turned it into something shameful and weak. He wrote about the night he confronted her, about the terrible things they had said to each other, and about the guilt he had carried ever since, wondering if his words had driven her over those cliffs or if she had simply chosen death over a life bound to him. He wrote that when he married me, he had told himself it was purely practical, a way to silence the scandal and protect Eleanor. But he admitted that even then, he had been lying to himself. He had noticed me from the first day I arrived at Ashford Hall, had been drawn to my quiet strength and my kindness to Eleanor, had felt something stir in his frozen heart that both terrified and compelled him. He had fought against it, had tried to maintain his distance, but that night in the portrait gallery, drunk and desperate and tired of being alone, he had given in. And afterward, he had been so afraid of what it meant, so certain that I would eventually betray him as his first wife had, that he had retreated behind his walls of ice and cruelty. He wrote about the ball, about Lady Pemberton's attack and the panic that had seized him when he saw the doubt and suspicion in everyone's eyes. He wrote that in that moment, all he could think was that I had been too good to be true, that I must have had ulterior motives, that the scandal would destroy him and prove that he had been a fool to trust again. So he had lashed out, had said the most hurtful things he could think of, had destroyed our marriage in a desperate attempt to destroy his own vulnerability before it could destroy him. And he had realized his mistake almost immediately, had understood as I stood there broken and humiliated that he had just committed the greatest sin of his life. The letter went on for pages, detailing his search for me, his growing desperation as month after month passed with no trace, his realization that I had disappeared completely, and that he would likely never see me again. He wrote that he understood why I had left, that he did not expect forgiveness, that he simply needed me to know that I had not been nothing to him. He wrote that I had been everything, the light in his darkness, the hope he had not dared to embrace, and that losing me had been the final, fitting punishment for all his sins. He ended the letter by saying that if I ever read these words, it would mean that he was dead and that it was too late for anything except this belated confession. He said he hoped I had found happiness, that I had built a life free from the shadows of Ashford Hall, and that I had forgotten him completely. I read the letter 3 times, and with each reading, I felt the layers of anger and hurt peeling away, leaving something raw and tender beneath. He had been wrong, so terribly wrong, in what he had done. But he had also been human, flawed and frightened, and trying to survive his own pain in the only way he knew how. I could not forgive him, not entirely, but I could understand him. And I could release the hatred I had carried for so long, let it dissolve into the sadness and regret it had always been masking. He had loved me, in his broken way, and I had loved him too, even if I had never admitted it to myself. We had destroyed each other, but we had also created Charlotte, and perhaps that was enough of a legacy for 2 people who had never learned how to love without destroying. I never told Charlotte about the letter. Some truths are too complicated for children to bear, and I wanted her to grow up believing in love and goodness, not weighed down by the tragic failures of her parents. But I kept the letter, tucked away in a drawer with the few other mementos of my time at Ashford Hall. And sometimes, late at night when I could not sleep, I would take it out and read it again, remembering the man who had been both my ruin and my salvation. And I would whisper into the darkness words I had never had the chance to say to him. I would tell him that I understood, that I forgave him, and that our daughter was beautiful and brilliant, and everything he would have been proud of if he had lived to know her. And then I would fold the letter carefully and put it away, and I would go on with my life, carrying my secrets and my scars with as much grace as I could muster. The years passed, and Charlotte grew into a remarkable young woman, poised and educated and full of promise. She knew she was the daughter of a duke, but she also knew that she was the daughter of a seamstress who had sacrificed everything to give her a future. She carried both legacies with pride, and she made me believe that perhaps, despite all the pain and the mistakes, something good had come from that terrible time at Ashford Hall. Lady Catherine remained a constant presence in our lives, a grandmother in all but name, and through her, Charlotte learned about her father's family without ever learning the full, dark truth of what had passed between him and me. And I learned, slowly and painfully, that life could continue after heartbreak, that love could be found in unexpected places, and that the past, no matter how heavy, did not have to define the future. I never remarried, never sought another love, because the Duke had taken something from me that could never be replaced. But I had Charlotte, and I had my work, and I had friends, and a home and a life that was my own. It was not the life I had imagined when I was a young woman arriving at Ashford Hall with hope and innocence intact, but it was a good life nonetheless, built from the ruins of everything I had lost. And sometimes, when Charlotte played the piano, or laughed at something I said, or looked at me with those dark, solemn eyes so like her father's, I allowed myself to remember. I remembered the man who had been the Duke of Ashford, cold and cruel, and yet somehow capable of love. I remembered the girl I had been, naive and hopeful, and believing that duty and kindness were enough to survive in this world. And I remembered the night we created Charlotte, the one moment of warmth and connection in all that ice and anger. It had not been enough to save us, but it had been enough to create something beautiful. And in the end, perhaps that was all any of us could hope for, to leave behind something good in a world that so often dealt in cruelty and pain. Charlotte was 15 years old when the truth finally caught up with us. It came not through Lady Catherine or through any revelation I had planned, but through a twist of fate that I could never have anticipated. We had been invited to spend the summer at the family estate in the countryside, something that had become an annual tradition. Lady Catherine had grown frail with age, and she wanted Charlotte to spend as much time as possible learning about the estate and the responsibilities that came with the Ashford name, even though the title itself had passed to a distant cousin. I had resisted at first, uncomfortable with the idea of returning to that part of the world where my past still lingered like a ghost, but Charlotte had begged, and I found it impossible to deny her anything. The estate was not Ashford Hall itself, which had been sold years ago, but a smaller property that had belonged to Lady Catherine's late husband. It was a beautiful place, all golden stone and rolling green hills, and Charlotte fell in love with it immediately. She spent her days riding horses and exploring the grounds, and I watched her bloom in the country air, her laughter carrying across the gardens like music. Lady Catherine and I would sit together in the afternoons, taking tea and talking about everything and nothing, and I felt something close to contentment settling over me. Perhaps, I thought, I had finally outrun the past. Perhaps the wounds had healed enough that I could return to this world without being destroyed by it. But on the third week of our visit, a carriage arrived bearing a guest I had not expected. It was Eleanor, the Duke's niece, now a young woman of 24, with her mother's delicate features and her uncle's dark eyes. She had been living in Scotland with her aunt's family, and Lady Catherine had invited her to visit, thinking it would be good for her and Charlotte to meet. I had not seen Eleanor since she was 6 years old, since those days when I had cared for her at Ashford Hall, and my heart clenched at the sight of her. She was beautiful and poised, but there was a sadness in her eyes that spoke of losses never fully grieved. Eleanor did not recognize me at first. 9 years had changed me, softened some edges and hardened others, and I was no longer the young governess she had known. But when Lady Catherine introduced us and spoke my name, Eleanor went pale. She stared at me as though seeing a ghost, and then tears began to stream down her face. She crossed the room in 3 swift steps and threw her arms around me, sobbing against my shoulder, and all I could do was hold her and whisper that it was all right, that I was here, that I had never forgotten her. When she finally pulled away, she looked at me with such raw emotion that it broke my heart. She said that she had thought I was dead, that after I disappeared, no one would tell her what had happened, and she had convinced herself that something terrible had befallen me. I took her hands in mine and told her that I was sorry, that I had not wanted to leave her but had no choice, that I had thought of her often over the years and hoped she was happy. Eleanor shook her head and said that she had not been happy, that after I left, the house had become unbearable, and her uncle had sent her away to live with relatives who were kind but distant. She said that she had felt abandoned by everyone she loved, first by her parents who died, then by me, and finally by her uncle who had withdrawn so completely that it was as though he had died long before his body gave out. She said that she had spent years trying to understand what had happened, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations and whispered gossip, but no one would tell her the full truth. It was then that Charlotte joined us, curious about the commotion, and Eleanor turned to look at her. I watched Eleanor's face as she took in Charlotte's features, the dark hair and eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself with unconscious grace. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she looked from Charlotte to me and back again, and I saw the moment understanding dawned. She knew. Without anyone saying a word, she knew exactly who Charlotte was. She looked at me with questions written all over her face, and I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. That night, after Charlotte had gone to bed, Eleanor and I walked in the gardens under a sky full of stars. She told me that she needed to know everything, that she had lived with fragments and shadows for too long, and that she deserved the truth. So I told her. I told her about the forced marriage, about the ball, about the annulment and my flight from London. I told her about the night that Charlotte was conceived, about the 3 years of poverty and struggle, about my decision to keep Charlotte hidden from the Ashford family. And I told her about the letter the Duke had written, about his confession of love and regret, about the man he had been beneath the ice and anger. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke, and her words were heavy with old pain. She said that her uncle had been a broken man long before I came into his life, that his first wife had destroyed something essential in him, and that he had never learned how to trust or love without fear. She said that after I left, he had fallen apart completely, and that she had heard him crying in the portrait gallery late at night, standing before the painting of his first wife and begging for forgiveness. She said that he had told her once, shortly before he died, that he had destroyed the only good thing that had ever happened to him, and that he did not deserve to be remembered with kindness. Eleanor said that she had been too young to understand then, but now, looking at Charlotte, she finally understood what he had meant. Eleanor asked if she could tell Charlotte the truth, if she could give her niece, for that is what Charlotte was, the full story of her parents and their tragic, complicated love. I hesitated, uncertain whether Charlotte was ready to hear such darkness, but Eleanor took my hands and said that Charlotte deserved to know that she was not just the product of duty and convenience, but of love, however flawed and damaged that love had been. She said that knowing the truth, the whole truth, would help Charlotte understand herself and her place in the world. And she said that secrets, no matter how well-intentioned, always found a way to cause harm in the end. I knew she was right. Charlotte was no longer a child, and she had begun asking more pointed questions about her father, about why I had never married, about the shadows that sometimes crossed my face when his name was mentioned. She was intelligent and perceptive, and she would eventually piece the truth together on her own. Better, perhaps, that she hear it from people who loved her, presented with compassion and context, than that she discover it through gossip or accident. So I agreed, and the next day we sat Charlotte down in the library and we told her everything. I watched my daughter's face as she listened to the story of her parents, watched the emotions play across her features, confusion and sadness and anger, and finally, understanding. She wept when we told her about the ball, about the cruelty of her father's words and my subsequent flight. She wept harder when I showed her the letter he had written, his confession of love and regret. And when we finished, she looked at me with eyes that seemed suddenly much older, and she asked me if I had loved him. I could have lied, could have told her that it had been nothing but duty and circumstance, but I found that I could not. So I told her the truth. I told her that I had loved him, despite everything, despite the pain and the betrayal, and that I believed in his broken way he had loved me too. But I also told her that love alone was not enough, that without trust and communication and the courage to be vulnerable, love could turn into something destructive. Charlotte was quiet for a long time after that, processing everything we had told her. Then she said something that took my breath away. She said that she was grateful to both of her parents, to her father for giving her life and for loving me enough to leave behind that letter, and to me for sacrificing everything to raise her and protect her. She said that she understood now why I had kept the truth from her, and that she did not blame me for it. And she said that she wanted to know more about her father, wanted to understand the man he had been before tragedy and pride destroyed him, wanted to claim all of her heritage, both the light and the dark. I held her close and marveled at the wisdom and grace of this young woman I had raised, this girl who had somehow grown into someone better than either of her parents had ever been. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Charlotte grew close, bonding over their shared connection to the Duke and their understanding of what it meant to be shaped by loss. Eleanor told Charlotte stories about her uncle when he was younger, before his first marriage, when he had been quick to laugh and generous with his affections. She showed Charlotte portraits and letters and mementos that painted a picture of a man who had been capable of great love before pain had twisted it into something else. And slowly, Charlotte began to form a more complete image of her father, not just the cold, cruel figure of my memories, but a complex, flawed human being who had done terrible things and good things and had ultimately been destroyed by his inability to forgive himself. Lady Catherine, sensing that the time was right, told Charlotte about the trust that had been established for her, about the inheritance that was rightfully hers. It was a substantial sum, enough to ensure that she would never want for anything, and it came with properties and investments that would provide her with independence and security for life. Charlotte accepted it with quiet dignity, saying that she would use it wisely, and that she would honor her father's memory by living a life of purpose and compassion. Lady Catherine wept with pride and relief, and I knew that she felt, as I did, that perhaps some good had finally come from all the tragedy and waste. As the summer drew to a close, Charlotte made a decision that surprised us all. She said that she wanted to return to London and continue her education, but that afterward she wanted to work with charities that helped women and children in poverty, women like I had been, struggling to survive in a world that showed them no mercy. She said that her father's money could do more good in the world than simply sitting in banks and investments, and that she wanted to create something meaningful from the pain of the past. I looked at my daughter, this remarkable young woman with her father's eyes and her own fierce heart, and I felt such overwhelming pride that I could barely speak. She had taken the worst of what both her parents had been, the pride and the fear and the inability to trust, and she had transformed it into compassion and purpose. Eleanor stayed with us through the autumn, and the three of us, along with Lady Catherine, formed something like a family. We were bound not by blood alone, but by shared history and mutual understanding and the determination to break the cycles of pain that had defined the Ashford line for so long. We talked late into the evenings about the past and the future, about the mistakes that had been made and the lessons we could learn from them. And slowly, painfully, I felt the last of my anger and regret dissolving, replaced by something gentler and more forgiving. It was on a crisp October morning, as I was packing for our return to London, that Charlotte came to me with the gold locket in her hand. She said that she had been thinking about it, about what it represented and why I had given it to her. She said that she understood now that it was not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of everything that had been lost and everything that had been saved. She said that she wanted me to have it back because I had earned it more than anyone, through the years of sacrifice and struggle and the strength it had taken to survive. I tried to refuse, but Charlotte insisted, and she fastened it around my neck with gentle hands. And as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, at the locket resting against my throat, I felt something shift inside me, some final piece of the past settling into place. We returned to London, and life went on. Charlotte pursued her education with passion and dedication, and she began working with the charities she had spoken of, using her father's money and her own considerable talents to make a real difference in the lives of women who had no one else to help them. Eleanor visited often, and she and Charlotte remained close, two young women connected by tragedy, but determined to build something better. Lady Catherine passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years later, content in the knowledge that the Ashford legacy would continue through Charlotte, and that perhaps, finally, the cycle of pain had been broken. As for me, I continued my work as a seamstress, not out of necessity, but out of love for the craft and the independence it gave me. I never remarried, never sought another great love, because what I had shared with the Duke, however brief and broken, had been enough for one lifetime. But I found peace in my work and in my friendships, and in watching Charlotte grow into the woman I had always hoped she would become. And sometimes late at night, I would touch the locket around my neck, and I would think of him, the man who had been my husband for one brief, terrible moment, the man who had given me the greatest gift of my life, even as he destroyed me. I thought about what might have been if he had been braver, if I had been wiser, if circumstances had been kinder. I thought about the life we might have built together, if we had been different people, if love had been enough to overcome our fears and our pride. But I also knew that dwelling on what might have been was pointless, that the past could not be changed, and that the only thing that mattered was what we did with the present. and I had done the best I could with what I was given. I had raised a daughter who was kind and strong and full of grace. I had survived poverty and loss and humiliation and had emerged on the other side with my dignity intact. I had learned to forgive, if not to forget, and I had made peace with the ghosts that had haunted me for so long. On the anniversary of the Duke's death, Charlotte and I would visit the family cemetery where he was buried, and we would lay flowers on his grave. Charlotte would stand there in silence, communing with the father she had never known, and I would stand beside her, remembering the man he had been, and mourning the love that might have saved us both if we had only known how to accept it. And then we would walk away, arm in arm, and we would go on with our lives, carrying our memories and our scars, but no longer weighed down by them. The years passed, as years do, and Charlotte married a good man who loved her for herself and not for her name or her fortune. She had children of her own, beautiful grandchildren who filled my later years with joy and laughter. And she told them stories about their grandfather, the Duke who had been both hero and villain, who had loved deeply and failed spectacularly, and who had left behind a daughter who chose to honor his memory by being better than he had been. She told them that we are all shaped by the past, but we are not prisoners to it, and that every generation has the chance to break the cycles that came before and create something new. And I, in my final years, looked back on my life with something approaching contentment. I had known love and loss, triumph and tragedy, poverty and prosperity. I had been broken and I had been healed, and I had learned that survival is not just about enduring pain, but about finding meaning in it. The Duke had given me Charlotte, and Charlotte had given me purpose, and together we had created something good from the ashes of something terrible. It was not the story I would have written for myself, not the happy ending I had dreamed of as a young woman arriving at Ashford Hall with hope and innocence intact. But it was my story, and I had lived it with as much courage and grace as I could muster. And in the end, as I lay in my bed with Charlotte holding my hand and my grandchildren gathered around me, I thought of the Duke one last time. I thought of the man who had destroyed me and saved me, who had given me the greatest pain and the greatest joy of my life. And I whispered into the gathering darkness words I had never had the chance to say to him in life. I told him that I forgave him, that I understood him, and that despite everything, I was grateful for the brief, terrible time we had shared. Because without it, without him, I would never have known Charlotte, would never have learned the depths of my own strength, would never have understood that love, even when it fails, can still create something beautiful and enduring. And then I closed my eyes and let go, at peace at last with the past and with the choices I had made, knowing that the story I had lived, with all its pain and all its beauty, would continue through Charlotte and her children and all the generations to come. The Duke had annulled our marriage in rage, had destroyed everything in a moment of fear and pride, but in the end, love had won anyway. Not the fairy tale love of storybooks, but the complicated, messy, enduring love of real people who fail and hurt each other, and yet somehow, against all odds, create something worth remembering. That was my story, that was our story, and it was enough.